Welcome back to another Campfire Stories, presented by the Malden Public Library. It's too hot for anything right now, including listening to long stories. Even the fire seems too much. I'm recording this on a day that is 90 and hazy with the smoke from the West Coast, and I just don't think I could do anything longer than a quick vignette, or perhaps 3. The nice thing about very short fiction is that it tickles that part of your reading brain that wants to think creatively without asking for too much of a commitment. In fact, our adult services librarian has a Friday series where she promotes some short reading just for this purpose. Something brief but satisfying. So here are 3 such quick stories to satisfy but not take up too much of your time. They're from the collection Tiny Nightmares, Very Short Tales of Horror, edited by Lincoln Michael and Nadzili Nieto. And if you like what you hear with these stories, you can request a copy of Tiny Nightmares, Very Short Tales of Horror from our library. Okay, so the first story is The Resplendence of Disappearing by Ivan Parra Garcia, translated by Alana C. Noyes. Let's begin. He pulled the wooden church door shut and looked up to the sky. Those blackbirds were still at it, flying circles around the sun in an orderly fashion, with precision even, never losing the measured distance between themselves. It had been more than 3 weeks since they showed up, and still no one knew where they came from, what they wanted, where they were going. He'd spent all day in the church's doorway, watching them through his solar-filtered telescope. He stared off on the dirt road toward town. Afternoon sun beating down on the half-naked crown of his head as he walked ponderously, his shoulders stiff as bricks, under his white t-shirt, collar unbuttoned. He ruminated on the lack of rain these last few months, about the news, about the suffocating September heat, but mostly he thought about the birds. As he walked along the highway, he turned back to look at the church. For the first time in his 50 years serving Christ, there was doubt in his heart, as if something more powerful than God himself had come to stay in Texarkana. He walked on, wishing he were at home in his rocking chair. The diabetes had left his heels cracked and covered in blisters, and his feet were aflame. Hip to toe, his legs ached. The doctor had forbidden him from extended periods of standing, but he hadn't paid him any mind. Stopping in front of a plot of land, he looked northerly, through the barbed wire where the coyote was stalking a young deer just a few meters from where he stood. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, licked his lips, and with a quick slap, obliterated a mosquito on his neck. Lifting the barbed wire, he crossed to the other side, one leg at a time. From there, he watched the coyote's eyes track the unsuspecting deer, which stood still as a statue, hidden among the dry branches. He lifted a rock, and with the little strength he threw it toward the predator. The rock thumped in the grass, and the deer shot off running, while the startled coyote panicked, scampering away through the bramble. Reverend Vargas trudged through the field. In 20 minutes, he found the dirt road again and walked on the rest of the way to town. He stopped in the doorway of Jose Peloponneso's cigarette shop, where Jose's daughter was sitting on a white plastic chair with the Friday's paper crossword and a mango popsicle. She was 30, with a dark complexion, broad shoulders, and deep coal-black eyes. "You see them flying lately?" asked Reverend Vargas, gesturing toward the firmament. "They look different, like something else." Melania gnawed at the popsicle as it began to melt. "They're just birds, Reverend," she answered, with a crossword splayed across her lap, popsicle in one hand, pencil in the other. She seemed annoyed. "Something strange about it. I've kept my eye on them all day. Sometimes seems like the light bounces off of them like a mirror, as if they're flying closer to the sun than they are to us." Melania looked at him, confused and incredulous, then surprised. If they were flying close to the sun, they would have burned up. She slurped at the popsicle. "You have Pepsi?" Melania rose, leaving the paper on her chair. She went into the store and came back with a can. He began to speak again, and she handed it to him. "You believe there's such a thing as non-human forces?" He continued, his gaze fixed on the sky, one hand cupping his forehead to shield his eyes from the light. "You mean God?" "No." This time, Melania looked at him suspiciously, warily, as if trying to decide whether he was putting her faith to the test. He went on. "All the ones who disappeared these last few weeks came back traumatized, but none can say where they went, why they disappeared. Never mind why they keep offing themselves once they're back. The police? The police haven't found a thing, not one clue," the Reverend interrupted. "Look," he pointed. "It's like they're from another world, flying without flapping their wings. They look like perfect triangles, silver-coated, as if they were made of titanium or tin." Melania sat down again, focusing her attention on the crossword. Reverend Vargas cracked open his Pepsi and turned to look across the street. A boy, maybe 6 years old, blew bubbles with a soapy wand in the shade of a nearby building. He looked up the street, down the street. A group of people gathered in front of Beanstar Bank, where they were talking about it too. One of them held the paper while the others read over his shoulder. They were arguing, as if they couldn't come to a conclusion about what it meant. One man, with a long goatee, looked up at the sky. A couple, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old apiece, looked over at the Reverend, a flicker of hope in their eyes. "I wish I could hope. I wish I could help," he murmured. "But this is out of God's hands." "Heron, finally!" Melania shouted, scrawling in the last word. "You say something, Reverend?" But he'd already walked out of the store, continuing down the main road. On his way back, not far from home, he was walking along the scrub brush-covered train tracks when he heard a noise that seemed to come from underground. He paused, looking up and down the tracks, but saw only one abandoned coal car. The sound was coming from behind it, a sharp, high-pitched yip, like a chirp. He approached the car. Amid the brush he spotted a brownish-yellow cat curled up into a tight ball of fur. As he bent down to pet it, he saw the deep wound carved into its right flank. Blood was pouring out. Placing 2 fingers behind its front leg, he felt for its heartbeat, which was slow and deep. It could barely breathe. On the ground next to it lay a bloody pocket knife, an empty bottle of whiskey, a pack of smokes. The Reverend looked up and saw 2 drunks fleeing down the tracks. He yelled after them, but they didn't stop. He felt as if he wanted to chase them, but didn't. Instead, he scooped up the cat, cradling it against his chest as he carried it home. By the time he arrived, the cat was gasping for air, meowing mournfully. A chill seemed to emanate from its skin. He quickly pushed open the door with his shoulder and set the animal down on his armchair. He filled a dish with water and set it down in front of the cat, but it wouldn't lift its head. Heading back to the kitchen, he flipped on the TV, listening distractedly to the news for a moment, before rushing to the bathroom for gauze and antiseptic. Then back to the living room. He crouched in front of the animal, soaking the gauze and dabbing it on the wound. The cat let out a muffled meow. He went back to the kitchen and stood watching the Channel 4 news. Another disappearance last week, back on Friday night. Self-inflicted death Sunday morning. Leaning both hands on the edge of the sink, he observed the world through the window. The sun had fallen in the sky and glowed reddish against the earth. He knew those birds weren't birds. They weren't of this world. They were something much more powerful. Something not even his faith could explain. He watched as a car sped down the road, leaving a cloud of dust behind it, abandoning Texarkana. The cat's labored meowing punctuated the overwhelming silence. He ran back to the living room and saw the awful hemorrhage that spread over the animal's body. In his more than 50 years of existence, he'd seen men and women cross that dark threshold into emptiness, oblivion. A bolt of lightning, slick as ice, ran through his heart. He could feel it growing, the fulminating hatred for those people he'd seen on the tracks. Reverend Vargas carried the inert feline body to the field in front of his house, tenderly placing it next to the garden. Returning to the porch, he slipped off his shoes and sat in the wicker rocker, contemplating the end of yet another day. I love a story that's pretty much a mood. All right, so 1 down, 1 to go. The next story is The Unhaunting by Kevin Nguyen. And without further ado, here we go. The Unhaunting. After Priscilla died, Carson's only hope was that he'd be haunted. She'd left this world suddenly, a heart attack, as if to spite her perfect health, as if the world were conspiring to make Carson tragically miserable. Once she was in the ground, Carson waited alone in the bedroom they had shared for 3.5 years. He wasn't sure how Priscilla's presence would manifest itself. Perhaps a movement in the dark, maybe a breeze that would rustle the sheets, or an astral projection? Carson missed his beloved so much that he would have been satisfied with a cold shudder and the feeling that she had passed through him. The first night, Carson lay awake, anxious in the hope that Priscilla would make an appearance. But each painful minute gave way to the morning, and Carson was left feeling disappointed, even a bit angry. No matter. She would materialize on the second night, he thought. That turned out to be wishful thinking. As the days went on, a week passed, and Carson remained unhaunted. Where had Priscilla gone? What was Carson doing wrong? He decided to Google it. It turned out there were a great number of things that Carson could have been doing wrong. A subreddit about interactions with the afterlife, our haunts, was full of tips and tricks and hacks, none of which were particularly consistent. One user recommended incense, another suggested candles, not lavender, but everyone agreed it helped to burn something. There were varying opinions on the effectiveness of incantations. Some felt the words would be powerful forms of summoning. Others found it useful just as a means of maintaining focus. Still, Carson practiced the easiest of rituals. Lights always off, of course. Open windows, Reddit advised, allowed spirits to enter more easily. It was cold out, but Carson was more than happy to bundle up to heighten his odds. A YouTube tutorial also had a handful of ideas, like spreading dirt on the floor to make the room feel more earthy. Certain patterns for candles, not lavender, should attract specters with more ease. Still, none of it worked. The internet was a crapshoot, really. But, as one YouTube commentator put it, Ghosts only emerge under specific spectral conditions that depend on them. The problem wasn't Carson necessarily. It was Priscilla. The feeling of cold, damp fingers, the musty scent of hair, an embrace of wet skin and jagged bone. Weeks went by, and Carson would only conjure these sensations in dreams. After expressing his woes to a close friend, Carson was referred to a specialist. He would be expensive, the friend warned, but Carson had nothing left to lose. He'd lost everything already. The initial phone call was strange. Carson felt it fair to ask about the man's accreditations and background. Shaman? Witch doctor? Exorcist? But the response was a light scolding that those terms were outdated and lightly offensive. He was simply known as Derek, the guy who could get the ghosts. Still, Derek was able to detail his track record. Carson's case was not unusual, just particular. Every ghost was unique, after all. Carson put down a significant deposit, and a couple hauntless nights later, Derek showed up at his front door. His appearance was different than Carson had expected. More normal. He came armed with a few Tupperware containers. Carson had imagined someone arriving with an otherworldly mystical aura to them. This guy had the fastidious energy of a house cleaner. In fact, the first thing Derek did was clean the dirt from the bedroom. "What is this?" he asked. "A nursery? You hoping your dead wife sprouts from the ground?" The phrasing forced Carson to hold back tears, and he immediately hated the man. Still, there was an efficiency to how he worked. Derek began rearranging the furniture. "Did Carson have more framed photos of his wife?" he asked, which sent Carson to the other rooms of the house to pull pictures off the wall and present them to Derek, who then piled them on the bed in a rather disorderly fashion. Did Carson have more of his wife's clothes? Derek wondered. And so Carson went to the closet and pulled out all of her dresses, shirts, pants, underwear even. Though it felt uncomfortable presenting his wife's undergarments to a complete stranger, Derek appeared confident. All the clothes were dumped onto the bed. The secret, Derek explained, was quantity, volume. If you wanted to be haunted, you needed to bring as many signals to the room as possible. Ghosts, like in Priscilla's case, couldn't find their way. The afterlife was confusing, a labyrinth, lost souls learning how to navigate distant planes in order to return to this one. 2 hours. "Yeah, okay," Carson said impatiently. "Listen," Derek went on. "I've never had trouble finding a ghost that wanted to be found." As night fell, Derek continued scanning the room. He checked the closets, opened drawers, flipped the light switch several times, all for reasons Carson couldn't understand, but had to trust were done with the confidence of experience and expertise. Derek had, after all, nearly a 5-star rating on Yelp. He laid down a series of blankets, cast dried rose petals on the floor, set out an array of candles, not lavender, of varying heights and widths throughout the room. Then he pulled out a large tome from one of his Tupperware bins, a massive, aged book, and flipping to a bookmarked page, he began chanting a phrase over and over. It wasn't in English, but a language that Carson couldn't make out. Maybe Portuguese? And as Derek repeated the incantation, the room began to shake. A wind blasted in through the windows. The candle flames seemed to grow, illuminating the room. Carson watched as Derek's pupils turned white. Outside, the clouds began to swirl, opening a path for the moonlight to shine directly into the room. "It's finally happening," Carson thought. "Priscilla, my love, we will be reunited soon." But in the chaos, nothing emerged. Eventually the wind stopped blowing, the candle flames returned to normal, and the clouds returned to concealing the moon. Derek had run out of breath and could chant no longer. "Wait, don't stop," Carson pleaded, but Derek, whose eyes were back to normal, could only muster a headshake. He'd done everything he could, but Priscilla would not appear. Derek was excellent at his job, but no matter how good he was at summoning specters, it would always be impossible to call on a ghost who did not want to appear. What did he mean, exactly, that Priscilla did not want to appear? "I don't know, man," Derek said. "That seems like something between you and her." Could it have been possible this whole time that it was no lack of skill or effort on Carson's part, but the fact that Priscilla was not looking for him at all? How could that be true? That his beloved was not searching for him? Priscilla would never abandon him. Not like this. Not after he tried so hard to make it work. This was typical Priscilla, selfish, unkind. Carson had never been anything but supportive, even in the worst of times, and now, after death, she couldn't muster the effort to haunt him once, just once. He asked so little of her, and yet... Derek finished packing his things, but the man was still rambling. With his Tupperware tucked under his arms, it seemed best to Derek to just leave his disappointed client as he was. He could hear the man going on and on still, even as Derek made his way downstairs past the hallway full of empty spots where photos used to hang. Even outside, as he packed his belongings in the trunk of his old sedan, the angered sounds of the man could still be heard in the distance. Indignation, it seemed, traveled far. As the house disappeared in Derek's rear view, he wondered if the man understood what had happened to him. This man was reckoning with the fact that now he was truly alone. But the thing he still hadn't comprehended was the lesson of it all, that it was likely his fault. But whether this guy would understand that was not Derek's concern. He had other clients, easier ones, people with ghosts who didn't feel better off gone. Whew, that was heavy, and also felt pretty good. Okay. So, on to our next story. The title is Veins Like a System, Ashani Surya. The doctor stands at the sink, filling a syringe with oil, viscous and strangely red-black. Finally, the liquid reaches the appropriate millimeter mark, a number Lane isn't privy to, and the doctor tips the needle back and forth, watching the oil slosh a little bit and settle. Lane tightens his fist, trying to coax the veins there to grow starker. This procedure, early petrochemical therapy, is a benefit, not yet available to the public, offered to employees of the oil company where Lane is a manager. He massages the skin at his inner elbow. "Are you sure about this?" Lane's wife, Catherine, asks from her chair. She still has her coat on, and she twists a loose thread around her pointer finger. "It's perfectly safe," the doctor says, even though Catherine might have been asking Lane. He sterilizes Lane's skin. It'll stimulate everything, keeping it all running, especially the organs. "Which organs?" Lane asks. "Deep breath," doctor instructs, and jabs the needle through the flesh. "Hearts, lungs, eyes, you'll be able to see when you're saturated." "Not in your eyes," Catherine says. Lane, not eyes." "It's part of the procedure," Lane says. "Oil is where the money comes from. It's how they buy their son, Ev, a new backpack when the old one is frayed. How they keep cut flowers on the dining room table instead of leaving the centerpiece empty. If there are lawsuits, the pelicans shaking their slick black feathers with despair, the whispers of colleagues in different states suffering from nausea, memory loss, Lane chooses not to play the poor fool cynic, too bitter and missing out. A few months later, Lane and Ev play basketball in the cracked driveway, weak spring sun traversing their spines. Ev dribbles through his leg and swishes past his father to score a layup. But Lane thinks of a recent pipeline fracture around Lubbock. A gelding took off by leaping across a fence, and when they found him in the long corridor of a cornfield, they pried his teeth open for a bit and found his tongue all inky shine, an ominous rainbow in black from drinking water from the stream. No choice. They put the poisoned horse down, and Lane wonders how much of the creature could have ingested. If it was more than the millimeters the doctor slips into his bloodstream every week. Just then, Ev barrels at him, elbows flailing, but Lane sidesteps and dodges the blow. His body locks, tensing for disaster, and doesn't relax. "Idiot!" Lane cries out, grabbing Ev's collar and shaking him with fury. "Dad!" Ev says slowly, wedging his fingers in the tight spaces between his father's digits. He looks away from Lane's gaze. He's been nervous ever since the veins in Lane's eyes turned black from the oil treatments. What are you doing?" Lane isn't usually prone to anger, but he understands his body as weaker now, even if it thrums with energy. What runs through him is volatile, not meant to spill out of the web into the rest of the cells. The safety he believed in before is tenuous. Slowly, he steps back, straightens his son's shirt at the shoulder blade, and retreats to the house. It takes less than purposeful violence to empty a vein. Just him dressing for church, while Ev complains about hating the preacher. It's then, as Lane agitatedly pulls clothes from his closet, that a belt buckle smacks into his eye, searing pain, blacking out his vision. And then he realizes that it's not just that, but oil leaking out, dripping down his cheek. He touches it again and again, smearing it around in his soft under-eye region. Someone pulls him along urgently. Don't look, Ev," Catherine says, closing the bathroom. She positions Lane under the light and tries to pry open his lids wider, but he winces. The half of his face covered in oil is burning, like the skin is freckling into 1,000 sores. Catherine wets the cloth under some water and presses it to his face, but it doesn't help. His eye is hot, and somehow it doesn't seem so solid, like pudding on a stove, like jelly mixed hard with a spoon. He can't see right. His vision teeters, unbalanced. "You should look at yourself," Catherine said. "You should see what you let them do." In the mirror, he has only one eye. The other is a dark, empty space, the inside burned away. He is raw. He is forever changed. When he looks back at Catherine, he sees that Ev has come inside anyway, though he hides his face in his mother's blouse. She is crying. No one told him about these close-up consequences of a leak. Maybe the Lubbock ground aches too. The gelding, just the visible harm. Lane wonders if they'll have to put him down now. When he looks at his family's faces, fighting the dizziness latched on like a mask over his mouth and nose, he understands what Catherine meant the first day when she begged him to spare his eyes. Once, the three of them owned the looks between them. No longer. So that's our final story. And man, I love short fiction. I love micro stories even more. It's really hard to make an impact with so little room to work with. And yet these authors certainly deliver. I hope you're enjoying the reading tonight. Campfire Stories won't be here next week. We're off to make room for some local authors to read their work online during our annual Writers Group public reading. You can watch them on our YouTube channel from 7 to 8:30. I'm pretty sure it's being recorded, so you can probably watch it after that, but definitely tune in at 7 to see some really talented local authors read their stuff. It's not to be missed. Until next time, stay cool, stay hydrated, stay well read, and have a good night. Thanks.